Well, we're continuing this series we're calling Out of Water, and today we will look at blame. I thought I'd begin by sharing what one woman wrote about her marriage. I thought I'd found the perfect man. He was everything I wanted, a good man who was both godly and trustworthy. We were married, but after a few short years, I began to see a side of my husband I'd never seen before. He developed an explosive temper. He became selfish with his time. He used serving God as an excuse to ignore me. He became hateful and sarcastic, belittling me in front of my friends and putting me down. I felt like he was ashamed of me and often treated me like a child. He would end my sentences for me and modify my advice whenever we'd be talking to our friends. Over the next several years, my husband became a full-fledged workaholic. The more I begged him to change, the more he isolated himself from me. The times I needed him most, that was when he was least available. Our fights increased, and I became angry and bitter. All my dreams of a happily ever after came crashing down. I began to wonder if it was better for our children to see us fight all the time and hate each other, or if it'd be better just to divorce. That was the summer of 1993, 27 years ago, when my wife, at the end of her rope, wrote that about me. I was that selfish, sarcastic, hateful man. 1993 was our 10th anniversary. Our marriage was cratering. It seemed like in 10 years that we'd been together, the only thing we learned how to do exceptionally well was to hang on to hurts and resentments and then hurl them at great velocity toward one another. We were really good at the blame game. We both had a laundry list of our partner's faults that at the drop of a hat we could pull out to shut them down, so that each time we blamed, what we did is we lost the present moment in all the pain of the past. We had so much unresolved stuff in our marriage that on our 10th anniversary, it passed without a kiss, without the words, "I love you," without a card. Can I tell you something from the heart? Blame will get you stuck more than any other thing. Blame originates out of this deep fear within us all that there's something deeply flawed with us. So what we have to do is we have to fight against any accusation of wrongdoing on our part. We have to put our failures out there on other people, not on us. For some of us in this room, blame is our reflexive response. It's our go-to. It's our default. It's where we go without thinking. We automatically begin to accuse. The first words out of our mouth are accusations and blame, rather than thinking even for a minute that we might have contributed to the problem. Now, I confess, Brenda and I waited until it was almost too late to seek help. By the way, that's what most couples do. The average couple will wait 6 years from the time they're aware they have a serious problem before they seek help. Now, 6 years is a long time to be stuck. That's 6 years of wallowing in misery. In 6 years' time, you can zero out on love and hope. You know, personally, I would rather work with a couple that are red hot in their anger toward one another than those that are in a Cold War. Because the ones that are in a Cold War have already zeroed out on any affection. But the people who are hot with anger, the reason they're angry is because at some level there's still fire in their bones. At some level they still care, or else they wouldn't feel the way they feel. They wouldn't do what they're doing. But you see, once you zero out, the fire goes out in the marriage, the motivation goes out the window with it. Statistically speaking, when couples wait 6 years before seeking help, only 1 in 5 can be helped in a lasting way. Now, I thank God that Brenda and I were in the 1 in 5, and I attribute that to the grace and love of God, that we were able to overcome the odds. I would also say I'm thankful that our marriage is not what it used to be. In fact, today I would say we have an amazing marriage, and I would wish it on every couple that you would enjoy what Brenda and I enjoy on a daily basis. We worked hard to achieve what we have together. But the truest thing I know right now is this: if you keep on doing what you've been doing, you're going to keep on getting what you've been getting. If you sit in any kind of problem just thinking it's going to improve on its own, I promise you it won't. Honestly, some people right now in this room are in deep weeds in a relationship that really matters. It could be your marriage is tanking, and you know really clearly, abundantly so, what the problems are in your spouse, but you're not as aware of how you contributed to the problems. Blame has become toxic in your marriage, and others of you, you're not married. Maybe this type of behavior is beginning to show itself in a dating relationship. It can manifest in relationship with your kids, with your ex, with your family members, at school, on the job. There is no discriminator when it comes to blame. We can blame in all kinds of relationships. But here's the deal. When you have protracted problems in a relationship, it all boils down to this first question in your notes. Do you want to feel better or do you want to get better? You see, a lot of us would prefer just to feel better. In fact, we've developed entire industries in this country to help people feel better. We just don't want to feel what we're feeling right now, so we'll invest all kinds of time, energy, and money in feeling better. Even if that means sometimes we're going to make the relationship worse in order to feel better, because some of us will run to our drug of choice, whether that's alcohol, actual drugs, prescription or non, or sexual addiction. We'll run to something to make us feel better, and you may forget about your problem in the moment while you're feeling better, but while you engage in those kind of behaviors, you're eroding the only foundation for a great relationship, and that's trust. You're destroying it. So some of us try this with God. We pray this, relieve my pain prayer to God. God, get me out of this. Help me to feel better. But you see, we serve a God whose primary interest is not in making us feel better, but helping us get better. And so he may not answer that prayer because sometimes it's our pain that's the only thing that's going to lead us back to the source of the problem, and sometimes our pain is the only thing that leads us back to God. Larry Crabb wrote a book years ago called Inside Out. In that book, he made a simple statement. I want to share it with you today. My pain is not the problem. The problem is my determination to relieve my pain any way I can. You see, my pain and your pain, that's really not the problem. What you believe to be the problem is not necessarily the problem. People's pain, their frustration, their disappointments, those things are not the problem. They're symptoms of the real problem. Think of it like this. Pain is what lies on the surface of your life. Pain is the first indicator that something is wrong. But what has to be addressed is not what's on the surface of your life, it's what's beneath the surface. And that's what this series has been about. This series is not about slapping Band-Aids on cancer. This series is about getting to some of those root behaviors, some of those core assumptions that we have that have actually been the saboteur of any kind of growth or any kind of real healing in our life. We want to address those kind of things, and one of those things is blame. So I want to share with you today a story from the Bible about pain and about blame and about how to deal with it. It begins where a lot of us are at, and that is with working a worthless solution. So where I want to call your attention today is in John chapter 5. It's a story that involves a man lying beside a pool very close to the temple in Jerusalem. Now, when we read this story in the Bible, we imagine this pool to be a small little pool with a lot of people around it. But back in 1956, archaeologists discovered the actual pool of Bethesda. Now, before that time, critics of the Bible said there is no such pool in Jerusalem. This is a totally made-up story. But archaeology proved them wrong, because you see what happened in the first century is when the Romans came and they absolutely decimated the city, they scraped it to its foundation. And they took all the stones from the temple and the buildings around, and they filled up every low place. And the pool of Siloam was about 40 feet underground. And it was just filled with rock. But once they excavated it, they found that this was massive. It wasn't one pool, it was two pools. It was surrounded by 5 different Roman colonnades. Bethesda is a name that means house of mercy. That ancient pool likely got its name from some miraculous healings that had happened there. Today, you even see a lot of hospitals called Bethesda. Have you ever seen a hospital called Bethesda? It's after this pool because, like I say, Bethesda means house of mercy. It's where the healing happens. So a lot of hospitals like to borrow on that name. So this particular pool is famous for its healing, not because of the water, but because of a legend associated with the pool that periodically an angel would come and trouble or stir the waters. And when that happened, the first person into the pool would get their healing. So that's the way this story begins, John 5, 5-6. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he'd been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" Now, I got to tell you, this has to be the most poignant question Jesus has asked in the Gospels. Not, do you want to feel better? Do you want to get better? Do you really want to get well? Now, some people think that's got to be the silliest question I've ever read, because of course the guy wants to get well. Why else would he be lying beside a pool that's reputed to have healing powers? But I'm going to show you it's not as simple as it may seem. In fact, there's an observation that a local pastor, his name's Bob Deffenbaugh, made about this passage that shifted my perspective on this story forever. I want to read it to you. He said, suddenly the waters of the pool begin to boil or bubble or froth in some way, and pandemonium breaks out. Every ailing person there is in competition with the rest of the multitude, who are also hoping for a healing. Can you imagine the pushing, the shoving, the tripping that takes place? And then, now here's the observation, okay? And then, even if one person was healed, it would not be the most needy person, because the one with the smallest ailment would be the most likely one to reach the pool first. That happens to be, I think, the most brilliant observation about this passage I've ever heard. And that is, if the legend is true, and the angel did come and stir the water, it only makes sense that the first person into the pool would be the least needy one, because the neediest people could not move as quickly as the more able-bodied. So think about it. You know, the guy with a sinus infection, he's able to leap over all these people with the mobility impairment and cannonball directly into the middle of the pool before everybody else, right? The least needy person would always get in first. Does that make sense? So now picture the scene. Bethesda is filled with masses of sick people and people with all different types of disabilities. It's like an ancient hospital, except this hospital has no walls and it has no doctors. Imagine how many contagious diseases were present and how easily they would spread in a packed group of people like that. Think about the despair and the desperation that people felt who were gathered around the pool. Now think about what would happen the second they saw that water begin to bubble. This massive humanity, all at the same time, would surge toward the pool. It would be complete chaos. It's every man for himself. As they say, desperate people do desperate things. And even though this pool is called the House of Mercy, it's anything but that. This is a cutthroat place. Everybody pushing and shoving to be there first. So, if this is the system you're working for your healing, if this is what you're banking on to get well, then the deck is already stacked against you, isn't it? I mean, your hope of getting healed at this pool, especially if you're as severely disabled as this man was, is practically nil. So Jesus' question is as honest as it gets. He shoots straight with the man. Basically, he says, look, do you want to sit here for the rest of your life trying to beat a system you have no chance of winning while blaming everybody else for your problems, or do you really want to get well? Given the facts of what happens at the pool of Bethesda, it makes you wonder, why does he come back every month, year after year, to this place, especially when he realizes he has no reasonable chance of winning in this game? So in a sense, Jesus' question is the perfect question. Do you really want to be well? Because if you do, you're going about it in the wrong way. Even if it could happen in this way, it's not going to happen for you in this way. What Jesus is saying is maybe it's time for a new approach. Maybe if what you're doing is not getting you where you need to be, you need to try something other than what you've been doing. By the way, this disabled man is not the only person in history who keeps working the same tired, broken solutions again and again and again, even when they don't work. When faced with a problem, this is our default. We go back to what we know. We never question whether it works or whether it's healthy or the right thing. We just do it. And that's what I did in my marriage. For years, everything we tried, everything we did, marriage encounter weekends, reading books, going to seminars, recommitting to our marriage, doubling down on our efforts, none of those things produced any solution to our problems. And honesty demanded that I face the truth. If I could have solved the problems on my own, in my own power, in my own wisdom, I would have done it long before we reached 10 years into marriage. Things weren't getting better. Things were getting worse. I needed help. I didn't need to keep working the same solutions that didn't work. You know, friends, it's okay to admit that life isn't working for you. It's okay to admit that the things you've tried are not panning out as you thought. It's okay to admit that, hey, we've tried these things and it seemed to help other people, but it's not helping us. It's okay to admit that, because you know what? The people that admit that, they get help. And everybody else gets to plaster a smiley face on and pretend that everything's okay when it's not. It's good. It's a sign of maturity to admit you need help. So let me remind you of the stuff that gets us mired down in the problem, because these are the things we see in this story. So Jesus asked the man a question, an honest question, a great question to get to the heart of the problem. Here's the man's response. Sir, the invalid replied, I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me. Now let me remind you, for 38 years, this man has lived as a beggar. For 38 years, he's been lying beside this pool. 38 years is a long time. 38 years ago was 1982. In 1982, I decided to go online. What was happening in 1982? 1982, Michael Jackson released Thriller, okay? That's how long ago 1982 was. The album, not this video. The video came out a year later. The first episode of Late Night with David Letterman debuted on NBC. The movie E.T. that debuted a 6-year-old Drew Barrymore came out in 1982. The first CD player was sold in Japan, and Ronald Reagan was president. Not just that, let's look at the economic reality of 1982. In 1982, the average income was just $21,050 a year. Now it's risen today to $63,179 a year, so we've tripled our income since 1982. But here's the bad news. GMC pickup, this is the basic one, the 1500, was $5,400. Today that same pickup, the basic, is $29,600. It's 6 times as much money. The average cost of a new house in 1982 was $82,200. It's now $315,000. It's 4 times as much money. The average rent in 1982 was $320 a month. Now it's $1,405, nearly 5 times as much. I think I see a problem here, right? I mean, our income has not kept up with some of the most fundamental aspects and costs of living in our world. So 38 years is a long time to wait for anything. Now, we don't know how old this guy is. We only know that he's been disabled for 38 years, but we do know in the first century, the average lifespan for a male was 40 years. So really what that tells you is this guy's had a lifetime of reinforcement in living this way. So what does 38 years actually mean? 38 years is enough time to give up hope. 38 years is a long time to begin to define yourself and look at yourself as a victim. So that's what I want to share with you, the signs that this guy begins to take on victimhood as a status. The first thing is we blame others. So when Jesus asked the man, do you want to get well? The man says, hey, you must be new around here. You know, you haven't seen what happens, because everybody, when I want to get in, they push me out of the way, they get in ahead of me. Now think about this. Jesus said, do you want to get well? The man's answer is not, yes, Jesus, I want to get well. The first words out of his mouth are blame. That's what happens. He blames. It's not my fault, Jesus. It's their fault. Sometimes what we think is our greatest need and our biggest problem is neither our greatest need nor our biggest problem. This guy thought other people were the problem. I promise you that was not the problem. In fact, Dr. Tony Evans, in discussing this passage, commented and said this: the real problem isn't the waiting, it's what happens in our heart while we wait. For too many of us, waiting creates a downward spiral of impatience, frustration, selfishness, and anger in our hearts. While waiting in line, we find flaws with the people in front of us. Isn't that true? I mean, not just true of this guy. I mean, he's looking around at everybody that beats him into the pool and finding fault with them. It happens at the grocery store. I mean, the judgmental thoughts, right, that run through our mind. Did you not know you were going to pay for this at the end of emptying your cart? Why is your wallet not out in time? You know, I mean, the things that we think when we have to wait. Thank you for the amen. So, when you blame other people for your problems, it becomes your preferred way of explaining why life hasn't worked out for you. I was dealt a bad hand of cards. I've been treated unfairly. People are aligned against me. So let me just say right up front, when you play the blame game, no one wins. It's not understanding about what happened or why it happened. It's finding someone to pin it on. It's trying to make somebody else feel responsible. That's what blame does. It points a finger at the people you think are responsible for your misery. We accuse others in order to defend ourselves. And let's face it, it's far easier to point a finger than it is to look inside. Eventually, blame begins to filter how we see reality. Now, the term for that is confirmation bias, which means I embrace the information that supports my conclusion and I ignore everything else. It's how your own brain works against you. It manipulates your perception so that you can only see what you want to see. Bible teacher and preacher Beth Moore emphatically says it like this: make no excuses, rationalize nothing, blame no one, humble yourself. Blaming's a waste of time, because no matter how much fault you find with the people that surround your life, nothing in you changes. The disabled man was able to point a finger at everybody who beat him into the pool, but nothing happened in him except his attitude got worse. When problems occur, no one wants to blame themselves, because things like anger and frustration and envy and guilt, they're not pleasant feelings. Blaming or scapegoating is a self-defense mechanism. You project onto others what you don't want to own in yourself. And so you point the finger at them and often accuse them of the very things that exist in your heart. This is why I've often said that blaming is a thinly veiled confession. That person is telling you something about what's broken in their own heart. Here's the thing I want you to keep in mind. Find a scapegoat, keep the problem. If your problems are always someone else's fault, if you're always a victim of your circumstances, then that by virtue means you're not going to make of your life what God intended it to be. Here's something related to blame. We become injustice collectors. Now, I was reading an article in Cosmopolitan magazine. Please understand, I don't subscribe to Cosmo. I don't regularly read Cosmo. This was an article online, and the woman's name was Susan Jacoby, and she's writing about people who begin to kind of take on the moniker of victim. And some of the behaviors she described included endlessly repeating how others have mistreated them, seeing the world as hostile and unfair to them, having a great deal of difficulty being able to forgive other people. Jacoby also has a way to colorfully turn a phrase. She said this: they become beachcombers of misery who see each grievance as a treasure to add to their collection. Have you known people like that? Of course, we all have. She then concluded her article with this: the injustice collector pays for that pleasure by giving up the hope of happiness. Only when we ask whether the price tag is too steep does change become possible. People filled with blame are not happy people. And when they finally understand that, that's the price I pay, then change becomes possible. Here's something else to keep in mind. We prefer familiar captivity over unfamiliar freedom. Now, that's not original to me. It was something C.S. Lewis said. The way he said it is a familiar captivity is frequently more desirable than an unfamiliar freedom. Now, Jesus knows it's hard to go from sickness to recovery. It's hard to go from letting something in life cripple you from being able to walk freely in Christ. Because to do that, we have to shoulder some new responsibilities and some new opportunities. Here's what I know. When you're not in touch with your own needs, invariably, you're going to focus on other people and their behavior. There's this great book called The Pursuit of Intimacy. It was written by a couple named David and Teresa Ferguson. And in this book, they were talking about a couple, much like what Brenda and I were, just mired down in blame. And they wanted to know what the couple hoped or expected to get out of counseling, out of therapy. But the first question they asked him was this: what do you need as an individual? Well, the wife spoke up immediately. She said, all I want is for Al to quit drinking and be home on time, then our marriage would be great. So get this. When she's asked about her need, she focuses on her husband's behavior. And the husband turns around and does exactly the same thing. He says, I want Sylvia to quit nagging me about drinking and being home on time. So he focuses on her behavior, she focuses on his. So the Fergusons asked Sylvia this question. They said, okay, what happens if tomorrow Al shows up at home on time, he's in his recliner, and he's sober? Are you telling us you feel abundantly loved? And she says, no, well, not at all. There's more to it than that. You see, what Sylvia needed was to be valued, to be loved, to be cared for, to be appreciated. Those are needs. But when she's not in touch with her real needs, she focuses on his behavior. And when he's not in touch with his real needs, he focuses on her behavior. You see, what I'm saying is, anytime you say, I need for you to do something, be something, feel something, you're not talking about your needs. Because needs are things like acceptance, appreciation, and affection. And when you lose conscious connection with your actual needs, you will focus on your partner's shortcomings and set up an adversarial relationship. So this is our familiar captivity, which leads to this. We have a need for things to be as they are. Every problem in your life, every problem in my life has a payoff. You and I wouldn't do it if we got nothing out of it. Even when the behavior is self-defeating, like blame. Many of us, we do it. You know why we do it? Because for some of us, it gives us an excuse for not looking at our own life. For others of us, it makes us feel morally superior to the person we're in conflict with. And still others of us, we get to play the part of the martyr because this person is just so hateful to me. You know, I did see on the back of a Christian magazine, there's this church that you can send to called the Church of Perpetual Peace. That if you can show them 3 things that you've suffered through, they'll give you a certificate of martyrdom, okay? And your name will be enrolled in that church for all perpetuity as a martyr. Now, I haven't discovered if you can submit other people's names yet, but I'm checking into that. Listen to what Joyce Meyer said. You can be pitiful or you can be powerful, but you can't be both. In other words, you can be a victim or you can be an overcomer, but you're not going to be both at the same time. I can't tell you the number of times I've seen this happen. One person in marriage begins to own their issues, do something about them, only to see their partner take a dramatic turn for the worse. Why is that? You think, if one is getting better, the whole relationship would get better, but that's not the case. See, here's the deal. When one person begins to heal, to face their issues, to own the broken side of their equation, they no longer react the way they used to react. So now when a fight happens, this person remains calm. They're clearly stating how they feel, what's really at stake. And you might think that their partner would say, gosh, they're so in control, I'm out of control, I'm obviously the one with the problem. But that's not the way it works. What happens is the person that continues to have a problem and won't deal with it, they escalate. Because they want to draw you back into the way you used to relate. Because that's their excuse for not dealing with their stuff. So what they say is, I got problems, you got problems too. And they want that line. And by the way, you start using that in a marriage, a dating relationship, you're already in deep weeds. I got problems, you got problems. Yeah, we all got problems. What are you doing about your problems? When we just use that as to say, hey, I'm content to wallow in this misery. No, that's not all right. So what I'm telling you is life may not be all you'd like it to be, but for many of us, it is as we need it to be. Because living in chaos, enduring toxic behavior, putting up with abuse, they're all bad things. But we need that behavior to excuse us not dealing with our junk. There's this guy, you probably recognize his name, Russell Brand. He's somebody people love or hate. There's a lot of things he says I don't personally agree with. But as best I can tell, he truly is owning the fact that addictions have ruled his life. So he's dealing with alcohol and drugs and sexual addiction, wrote a book about it. In that book, he asked a really good question I want to share with you today. Ask yourself, do I really want to change, or do I just want to justify staying the way I am? So in our time remaining, let me show you how Jesus deals with this man, and I call this Jesus' method of healing. Look at John 5, 8-9. Then Jesus said to him, get up, pick up your mat, and walk. At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. So this guy's identity is wrapped up in being a victim. The truth is our character defects, we practice them. They become built into our personalities. We own them through practice. And because it becomes such an integral part of us, we're afraid to let it go. I mean, what would we do if we could no longer self-handicap? What if I couldn't blame my parents, my spouse, my kids, my boss for my problems? What if I was 100% responsible for my own happiness? So Jesus says 3 things to the man. He says, rise, pick up your mat, and walk. Those 3 things hold the key to breaking free of blame. Number 1, he asks the man to do an impossible thing. So he asks the guy to do what he can't do, what he hasn't been able to do for 38 years. He tells him to rise up. Maybe God is saying right now to you to rise up. Because some of us right now, we're dealing with problems. It may be a relationship problem. It may be a personal problem. It may be a relationship that's in deep trouble. Maybe blame has characterized that relationship for some time. Maybe it is you have an addiction. You blame everybody else for your addiction and all your choices. Whatever it may be, you need to break free. And what God does is he comes to us, we pray and we say, God, take this away from me, heal me, make me better. And that's great. I love that you pray like that. But don't be surprised when God has a word for you too. And he says, get up, rise up, go to a meeting, take the first step, make an appointment with a therapist, enlist in a community group, go see a pastor and have a conversation, take personal responsibility. On Sunday nights here at Springcreek, this building fills up with people who are dealing with their junk. People in NA groups, people in different kinds of support groups, they come together here and they work through their stuff. All around this building, within about a 10 to 15 mile radius, there's all kinds of secular AA and NA meeting halls, and our people fill up those places too. And I know people in this room right now who have 5, 10, 15, 20 years of sobriety from drugs and alcohol who've told me, Pastor, anytime someone wants to be set free and they want to go to a meeting, introduce them to me. I'll take them to a meeting that day. They can go with me. Sometimes God is saying, rise up, go to the place where the healing happens, and we got to do that. There's some of you in this room, you live in isolation. And it's great that you come here. We love that you're here, and you can be anonymous for as long as you want to be anonymous. Some people just need to come into this place and heal for a while before they trust it and decide, hey, I want to connect with some other people. But please know, you're not going to become all that you were meant to be living life in isolation. Spiritual life is not me, myself, and I. It's about we. It's about all of us. So some of you, God is saying, hey, step out of your anonymity and step into community. Make a difference there. Others of you, your first step is just admitting that you have a problem. The first step is asking Jesus to do in you what you presently believe to be impossible. Because you know what? If you don't ask him, he can't do it. But he's telling you, when he tells you to rise, it's because you can rise. It's because you can do the thing he's asking you to do. So the first thing is to rise up, to do the impossible thing. The second is to make no provision for relapse. Jesus tells a man to pick up his mat. Now, he's had a 38-year relationship with his pain. His disability, and more particularly his victimhood, has defined him so much so that Jesus is wanting to say to him, are you ready for a new life and a new identity? So when Jesus tells him to take up his mat, what he's saying is you don't ever need to come back here again. For change to really happen, you've got to embrace a new identity, a new way of being in the world, and leave the old ways behind. Priscilla Shirer said it so well. She said, you're no longer the same person you used to be, so you have no business going to the same places you used to go. Now, you might be tempted to think, what's one more mattress among so many disabled people? But let me tell you something. If he let his mattress there, he probably would have been back in it the next day. Jesus is saying, shut off the possibility. Cut ties with the past. Some of us, we don't pick up our mats. And what we do is we go back to the pool and we play the game again that we can't win. You've tried those things before. They didn't work back then. They're not going to work now. So you pick up your mat. You cut off ties to the old ways. As long as you live by your old ID badge, you're not going to rise above it. So have you picked up your mat? Jesus is saying to be healed, make no provisions to go back. So some in this room, the best thing you could do, go home and pour out the booze. Go flush the drugs. Go tell some friends, we're done. I had a very dear friend. I led him to Christ years ago in his living room over there in East Garland. And he and his wife, Karen, it's Keith and Karen Engler. Keith was telling me after the first service, God got a hold of his life. I'll never forget, when Keith gave his life to Christ, his wife had been a Christian for some time. So he prays, he trusts Christ. He looks at her, and I'm telling him about what his next steps are, how to grow as a Christian. And he's looking at her, he said, did you know this stuff? It's like, have you kept this from me? I've wanted this all my life, But he told me not long after he gave his life to Christ, an old friend that he used to get in big-time trouble with called him and said, hey, Keith, want to get together for a beer? And Keith just said, no, and hung up on him. That was it. But he just knew this guy was nothing but problem for his life, so he said, no, we're done. Third thing, Jesus expects continued success. So the third thing Jesus tells the man is to walk. In other words, don't expect to be carried. If God gave you the power to rise up, he'll continue to give you the power each and every day to keep on walking. You see, the solution to this man's problem was Jesus. But the man didn't see it that way. The man thought Jesus was going to be his help to get him into that pool. But Jesus had a completely different idea from that. He was going to help that man to rise up and be healed. Now, we do the same thing with God all the time. We have everything figured out in our life. He just needs to do it our way. You know, we're in a relationship. You know, God, it's her. That's the problem. You fix her, everything's fine. We know the solution to the problem. And you know what? Our problem's not the problem. Our pain's not the problem. The surfacey stuff in your life, that's not the problem. It's the stuff going on underneath. And he knows that stuff, and he wants to get to it. So maybe to get something you've never gotten, you got to do something you never did. And that's what I ultimately had to decide and understand. You know, it didn't matter whether my wife was going to own her junk or see her junk. I knew she had junk. I knew it. I had a laundry list of stuff in her life that was wrong. But she was right about my laundry list too. And I knew I needed help. And I went to a 12-step group as a pastor called for codependency, and sat there and listened to people talk about how God had healed their life, the stuff I was needing desperately in my heart. I began to pour myself out in that group, and God began to do healing work, got involved in therapy for a couple years. I mean, God did some amazing things in my life, but I had to own my junk. I always think of the guy Viktor Frankl. You know the name? Viktor Frankl was an Austrian psychologist, and he was arrested during the Nazi regime, was put into a death camp. Now, the man had been a prolific writer, and when he was taken away with very few possessions, the one thing he grabbed were all of his writings. When he arrived at the death camp, not only did they take his family away, they took all of his writings, they stripped him of his clothes, they shaved all of his hair, they even took his wedding ring. And he's being interrogated by these Nazis under these glaring lights, and in the middle of that interrogation, he has an epiphany. People can do all kinds of hateful things to me. Things can happen in my life that I can't control. I'm not saying that you can't be a victim of somebody else's hateful or abusive patterns. I get that. But being a victim and taking on the status of victimhood, of victimism, is something totally different. And what he begins to understand, what Frankl understands, is people can do all kinds of horrid things to me, but they can never take away my power to choose my reaction. And that's what he did. He wasn't going to let them rob him of his power to make his own choices. And you always have that, no matter what's happened to you. I'm not saying people can't hurt you. People can. People can betray you. People can do mean things. People can undermine you. People can be really hateful sometimes. But guess what? They have no power to choose your response. That's always your power. And what I choose, and what I think that God is choosing, and ultimately what God does for this man, is he sets him free because we choose healing. We submit and we say, yes, I'm going to rise. I'm going to pick up this mat and I'm going to keep walking with you, Jesus. And Jesus is speaking into your situation right now. Would you pray with me? Father, I just lift up the people in this room, especially those that maybe have been doing life on their own terms for some time, and they're just at a place now where they can admit it's not working. It's not working my way. Everything I've tried to do to manage my life, to manage my problems, to deal with my circumstance, to deal with my painful past, all those things, they just come up short. And what I need desperately now, God, is for you to do in, through, and for me what I cannot do for myself. And so, God, I rise up and I say, I'm a mess. I have problems. I'm a sinner. I've done life my own way. I want Jesus in my life. There are other people in this room that right now, their most prized relationship, whatever that might be, between them and a child, between them and a parent, between them and their spouse, is in deep jeopardy, largely because of blame. They've allowed this blanket of blame, this default mechanism to be their way of explaining life and their problems. And all that's doing is getting them stuck. They're not winning at this. They're just mired down in their problems more deeply. Help them to understand, God, there's a better way. That, Lord, you're calling us to a life of responsibility, of taking ownership for our side of the street and the mess that's there, and to submit that to you and to believe, God, that you're a healer, that you're the lover that we've always desired, that you're able to do in us what needs to be done. And God, for anybody in this room that maybe it's more personal, maybe it's an addiction, maybe it's a habit that has them enslaved, maybe it's something, God, that continues to derail them personally in their job or at school. I pray, God, that they would take that thing and believe, God, that through confession, through owning it to you, that is the beginning of something amazing, some real healing that could happen in their life. Help them to have the courage to admit that life is not working the way they're doing it, and to believe, God, that your way is the one true way. I thank you, God, for what you're doing in this place. I thank you, God, for every soul that says yes to you, that you will align the resources of heaven behind that decision to make sure, God, that they know that you're for them, that you love them, that you're working to complete the promise you made. In Jesus' name, amen.